Judge Edward Hamilton adjusted his glasses, his expression cold and serious. The courtroom was packed, tension hanging heavy in the air. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. He was about to announce a decision that could shake the entire town. But then, something unexpected shattered the silence. Woof! Woof! Heads turned in unison. Standing in the middle of the aisle was a German shepherd, thin and dirty, her sharp gaze unwavering. Her name was Molly. Her deep, insistent barking echoed off the wooden walls, commanding attention. A security guard moved toward her cautiously, but Molly didn't back down. She stood her ground, her eyes locked on a single man, Howard Burke, the defendant. Burke's face went pale. His calm, confident facade crumbled as soon as his eyes met Molly's. His hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Everyone noticed the change. His fear was undeniable. It was as if he recognized her, though that seemed impossible. Molly stopped barking, but her presence alone spoke louder than words. "Get that dog out of here," the judge ordered, slamming his gavel. The security guard hesitated. Molly let out a low growl but remained rooted to the spot. Slowly, she took a few deliberate steps toward Burke. The tension in the courtroom thickened with every movement. No one dared to breathe. In the front row, Rachel Morgan, a seasoned reporter, leaned in and whispered to her photographer, "It's like the dog knows something, and she's here to make sure we all find out." Burke's breathing became shallow. Sweat trickled down his temples. His lips quivered as he mumbled, barely audible, She can't be. I thought she was dead." Gasps spread through the courtroom like wildfire. The murmurs grew louder. Molly stopped just in front of Burke, staring up at him with an intensity that silenced the entire room. Every person present sensed that a dark truth was about to be revealed. There was no turning back now. The room remained eerily silent, except for the faint ticking of the courtroom clock. All eyes were on Howard Burke, who sat frozen like a man facing his worst nightmare. Molly didn't move. She stood firmly in front of him, her eyes locked onto his, unrelenting. It was as if she was waiting for him to confess to something no one else knew. Judge Hamilton tapped his gavel again, his voice booming through the heavy stillness. "Mr. Burke, care to explain your reaction?" Burke struggled to form words. His throat felt tight, as though the weight of his own secrets was suffocating him. He glanced nervously at his attorney, who leaned in and whispered urgently. Burke shook his head, his eyes darting back to Molly. For years, he had buried the events that this dog symbolized, events he thought would never resurface. And yet here she was, as real as the shame and guilt that clawed at his mind. Rachel Morgan, the reporter, sensed that this was no ordinary disruption. She scribbled notes feverishly, her instincts screaming that she was about to witness the breaking point of a man unraveling. Her camera operator adjusted his focus, capturing every subtle shift in Burke's expression. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It had turned into a reckoning. Burke swallowed hard. His voice, barely more than a whisper, finally broke the silence. "This can't be happening. She was supposed to be gone." "She? Are you referring to the dog?" Judge Hamilton pressed, narrowing his eyes. Burke nodded slowly, his eyes full of dread. Molly let out a soft, low whine, as if urging him to continue. Burke felt cornered. Memories he had tried to suppress for over a decade came flooding back. The sound of barking on that rainy night, the fear in his chest as he had driven away, abandoning what he thought was a lifeless body in the mud. But Molly had survived, and now she had returned, standing as a living testament to what he had done. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled again. Burke's lawyer stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. It's a distraction. Surely the presence of a stray animal can't." "Enough," the judge interrupted, his tone sharp. He leaned forward, studying Burke with suspicion. "We're going to get to the bottom of this. Security, hold your position." "The dog stays." Gasps filled the room. The guard, who had been waiting for an order to remove Molly, nodded, and stepped back. Burke's breathing became erratic as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Molly remained steady, her gaze never wavering. The entire courtroom watched in tense anticipation, knowing that the next revelation could change everything. Burke's mind spiraled into a torrent of memories, drowning out the murmurs around him. It was a stormy night over 10 years ago, the night that had haunted his dreams ever since. Rain had poured relentlessly, turning the dirt road into a treacherous path of mud and darkness. He had been in a rush, panicked, reckless. He hadn't seen Molly until it was too late. The headlights had caught a brief glimpse of her soaked figure before the impact. The courtroom faded from his vision as he relived the moment. He remembered the heavy thud as the car hit her, the way his heart had leapt into his throat. He'd slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt. In the pouring rain, he had gotten out and found the dog lying motionless in the mud. He'd stood there for what felt like an eternity, drenched and trembling. He hadn't known what to do. Fear consumed him. He wasn't just afraid of what had happened. He was terrified of what it would mean for his reputation. Burke had made a decision that night. Instead of calling for help or checking if she was still alive, he had driven away, leaving Molly behind in the storm. He convinced himself she wouldn't survive and that no one would ever find out. For years, he carried that secret deep inside, burying it under layers of denial and self-justification. But now, here she was, standing before him as a living reminder of his cowardice. His attorney noticed the faraway look in his eyes and leaned in again. "Howard, you need to focus. What's going on? Who is this dog to you?" Burke blinked rapidly, snapping out of the memory. His face was pale, his lips dry. He glanced at Molly once more. She had stopped whining and now stood silently, her presence more powerful than any accusation could be. He could feel the weight of the entire courtroom bearing down on him. He couldn't escape the truth any longer. His voice was unsteady as he spoke. I thought I killed her, but she survived." The room erupted into chaos. Journalists clamored to capture the scene, their cameras flashing furiously. People whispered in disbelief, exchanging wide-eyed glances. The judge pounded his gavel repeatedly, his voice booming over the noise. "Order in the court! Order!" The echoes of the gavel reverberated through the chamber, but the shock remained palpable. Molly stood motionless, her gaze never leaving Burke. For the first time in years, the truth had been spoken aloud, and there would be no way to bury it again. Burke slumped in his seat, his hands trembling uncontrollably. Everyone knew the trial had just taken a dramatic turn, and the worst was yet to come. The courtroom was still buzzing with murmurs, despite the judge's repeated calls for order. Journalists were already crafting headlines in their minds. "Defendant admits to hitting and abandoning dog years ago." Cameras clicked furiously, capturing every reaction from the stunned audience. Burke's confession had turned the trial into something far more personal and damning than anyone had expected. Judge Hamilton's patience was thinning. He glared at Burke, his eyes like ice. "Mr. Burke, you just admitted to hitting and leaving this dog for dead. Is that correct?" Burke hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for words. He felt the crushing weight of his past pressing down on him. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, signaling him to stay calm. But how could he? The truth was out now, and the eyes of the entire courtroom burned into him. "It was an accident," Burke finally muttered. His voice was barely audible. He avoided Molly's gaze, ashamed to meet those piercing eyes. "I didn't know she would survive. I panicked and left." A sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. The judge's face hardened with disappointment. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "So you hit an animal with your car and left her to die in the middle of a storm. And now she's standing here alive as evidence of your actions. Tell me, Mr. Burke, what else have you tried to hide?" Burke's entire body went rigid. The judge's words were merciless and exacting, shaking him to his core. His mind raced with panic. He couldn't allow the situation to escalate further, but every move he made seemed only to dig a deeper hole. Molly remained an unyielding presence, her silence louder than any accusation. Rachel Morgan, watching from the front row, felt the gravity of the moment. She turned to her photographer and whispered urgently, "This case is no longer just about corruption. The town will tear him apart when they hear this. Keep recording every second." The atmosphere was suffocating. Burke shifted nervously in his seat as whispers grew louder again. He had expected the trial to challenge his career, his finances, even his future. But he had never anticipated this confrontation with his darkest moment. The judge sighed heavily and rested his gavel on the bench, his voice quieter but no less authoritative. "Mr. Burke, I'm giving you one opportunity to come clean. If you withhold any more truths, you'll face consequences far worse than public shame." Burke's pulse quickened. The walls seemed to close in on him. He couldn't see a way out, but the presence of Molly was inescapable. The truth had started to unravel, and he knew it was only the beginning. Burke sat motionless, his thoughts racing back to that fateful night. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He had convinced himself for years that no one would ever know, that the darkness of that stormy evening had buried his crime forever. But Molly's presence had torn through that illusion. She was a specter from his past, and now there was nowhere left to hide. Judge Hamilton's eyes bore into him like daggers. His tone was cold and deliberate. "I'm waiting, Mr. Burke. You've already admitted to hitting this dog and leaving her to die. Are there any other details you've neglected to mention?" Burke swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced at Molly, who stood quietly, her gaze unwavering. The memories began to flood back in vivid detail. The storm, the flash of her eyes in his headlights, the sickening impact. But it wasn't just the accident that haunted him. There was more, a deeper fear he had locked away. He had been transporting documents that night, documents that could expose powerful people. He knew if anyone discovered what had really happened, it would destroy both his career and others. The judge spoke again, snapping Burke out of his daze. "Answer the question, Mr. Burke. The longer you remain silent, the worse this will be for you." Burke's lawyer intervened, standing quickly. "Your Honor, I respectfully request a brief recess. My client is clearly under extreme distress." "Denied," Hamilton said firmly. He glared at the attorney before turning back to Burke. "We're all ears, Mr. Burke. If you have something to say, now is the time." Burke exhaled shakily. His lawyer leaned in again, whispering urgently, "Howard, you have to stay calm. Don't let them pressure you into saying something that could incriminate yourself further. We'll handle this carefully." But it was too late. Burke knew that this wasn't just about his actions anymore. The truth was clawing its way to the surface, and every second of silence made the tension in the courtroom unbearable. His reputation, his life, it was all crumbling before his eyes. And Molly, she wasn't just a reminder of the accident. She was the embodiment of everything he had tried to escape. Rachel Morgan's instincts sharpened. She could see Burke unraveling, each moment bringing him closer to a breaking point. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied his face. "Come on, Burke," she whispered under her breath. "What else are you hiding?" The courtroom fell into a tense hush once more. Molly remained still, her quiet presence unrelenting. The past was closing in fast, and everyone in the room could feel it. Burke's hands trembled as he wiped the sweat from his brow. His gaze darted around the courtroom, searching for an escape, but there was none. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating him. Molly remained rooted in place, her eyes like mirrors reflecting his guilt. The silence in the room was deafening, each second dragging out like an eternity. Burke could feel every set of eyes piercing through him, waiting for him to crack under the pressure. Judge Hamilton leaned forward, his voice steady but forceful. "You're wasting this court's time, Mr. Burke. Either you speak, or I'll make my own conclusions based on your behavior and your confession thus far." Burke flinched. He knew the judge wasn't bluffing. The weight of the truth pressed on him, unbearable. He finally let out a long breath and spoke, his voice shaking. "It wasn't just an accident that night." A wave of gasps rippled through the room. Rachel Morgan's pen flew across her notepad as she captured every word. The judge narrowed his eyes, leaning in closer. "Explain," he commanded. Burke hesitated, his mind tangled in fear and regret. He knew revealing the full truth could ruin not just him but also others, powerful people who wouldn't take kindly to being implicated. He took a deep breath and tried to gather his thoughts. "I was transporting sensitive documents that night, documents that could have exposed corruption involving several high-profile figures in the city." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Voices overlapped in shock and confusion. Journalists scrambled to report the bombshell revelation. Burke's lawyer stood abruptly, raising his voice over the noise. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant to the current trial. I object to any further questioning on matters unrelated to my client's defense." Judge Hamilton slammed his gavel multiple times, restoring order. "Irrelevant? I think not. Mr. Burke has admitted to a cover-up tied to both the accident and matters of public interest. We'll pursue this until we get to the bottom of it." Burke sank into his chair, his face pale. The walls were closing in faster now. His lawyer whispered furiously in his ear, but Burke barely heard him. Molly stood still as ever, her presence commanding the room without a single sound. He knew there was no turning back. The secrets he had guarded for years were unraveling in front of everyone. Rachel Morgan leaned toward her photographer. "This is going to blow the entire case wide open. Keep the camera rolling. We're witnessing the end of Howard Burke's empire." The tension in the room was suffocating. All eyes were back on Burke, waiting for him to continue. The weight of his lies, his mistakes, and the dark truths of that stormy night pressed down on him like a tidal wave. Everyone in the courtroom could feel that the worst was still to come. Burke sat slumped in his chair, his mind spiraling. Every word he had just spoken echoed in his head. He had crossed a line, one he couldn't uncross. The people he had once called allies, those whose secrets he had protected, would come after him now. Molly hadn't just exposed his guilt. She had shattered the delicate house of cards he had built over the years. He felt trapped, drowning in fear and shame. Judge Hamilton adjusted his robe and spoke with a cold authority. "Let's get something straight, Mr. Burke. You're suggesting that the accident wasn't the only crime that night. Are you now admitting to being part of a larger cover-up involving these documents?" Burke opened his mouth to respond but faltered. He didn't know how to navigate this without making things worse. His lawyer intervened quickly, raising his voice. "Your Honor, my client is under extreme duress. We cannot allow these accusations to continue without proper context. This line of questioning is prejudicial." The judge's gavel slammed down, silencing the attorney. "Enough! The court isn't blind to what's happening here. Your client made these claims, and now he'll be held accountable for them. We will not tolerate obstruction." The courtroom buzzed again, tension crackling like electricity. Molly remained unmoving, her eyes steady on Burke. Rachel Morgan leaned forward, sensing that the next few moments would determine the course of the trial. Burke inhaled sharply, then finally spoke. "I wasn't alone in this. The documents I had that night contained evidence of illegal dealings, contracts, payoffs, money laundering. I panicked after the accident. I thought someone might use it against me. So, I destroyed them." The room erupted in chaos. People whispered and gasped in shock. Rachel's eyes widened in disbelief as she scribbled furiously in her notepad. "You destroyed evidence of corruption?" The judge's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Mr. Burke, do you realize the magnitude of what you're confessing to right now?" Burke nodded weakly, his gaze locked on the ground. He felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, with nowhere to go but down. His lawyer grabbed his arm, whispering harshly, "Howard, you're digging your own grave. Stop talking. Let me handle this." But Burke shook his head slowly. He knew the truth had been buried for too long. The fear that had driven him to stay silent all these years no longer held power over him. He looked up at Molly, who watched him without judgment. Only an unwavering presence that refused to be ignored. Rachel whispered to her photographer, "This is going to take down more than just Burke. We're talking about major players in the city's elite, Judge Hamilton tapped his gavel again, demanding order. The entire courtroom could feel the gravity of what had just been revealed. The walls were closing in on not just Burke, but on everyone whose names were hidden in those long-destroyed documents. There was no stopping the reckoning now. The courtroom had descended into barely contained chaos. Reporters whispered furiously among themselves, cameras flashed, and spectators gasped in disbelief. The gravity of Burke's confession rippled through the room like a shockwave. Molly remained motionless, her silent presence commanding the room in a way that no person could. It was as if she were waiting for one final truth to surface. Judge Hamilton, visibly frustrated, slammed his gavel several times. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom." The noise died down to a tense murmur. Hamilton's eyes locked onto Burke, his voice steady but sharp. "Mr. Burke, you've admitted to destroying crucial evidence of widespread corruption. Do you understand the legal ramifications of this? You're implicating not only yourself but others who could face serious criminal charges. I need names. Now!" Burke's face twitched. The room fell into an expectant hush. His mind raced. He could feel the walls of the courtroom closing in tighter than ever. If he gave names, he would be signing his death warrant in more ways than one. These weren't just wealthy or powerful people, they were dangerous. People who wouldn't hesitate to retaliate. He knew he was on a precipice. His lawyer leaned in, his voice low and urgent. "Don't do this, Howard. You still have options. We can negotiate. You don't have to incriminate anyone else." Burke shook his head, his jaw clenched. He knew he couldn't run from this anymore. Molly had forced him to confront the past he had tried so hard to bury. The fear that had paralyzed him for years was slowly loosening its grip. He stood to face the judge. "Yes, I destroyed the documents. But I wasn't acting alone," he said quietly, his voice gaining strength as he continued. "The people involved, they're the ones who've been controlling this city for years. I have no proof left, but I can name them." The room exploded with noise again. Gasps, furious whispers, and the scribbling of notes filled the space. Rachel Morgan's pen moved faster than ever. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. "He's really going to do it," she whispered to herself. Burke took a deep breath, scanning the room. His eyes briefly met Molly's. For the first time, he didn't feel fear. Instead, he felt an odd sense of relief, as if confronting his demons head-on was the only way to finally free himself. He looked back at the judge. "But if I talk, I'll need protection. These people, they won't let this go." Hamilton nodded solemnly. He could see the fear in Burke's eyes, but also the resolve. The courtroom remained dead silent, all eyes on the man whose confession had shaken the foundations of power in the city. Everyone knew that once he uttered those names, the entire system would be thrust into chaos. Molly remained where she was, a steady reminder that truth had a way of resurfacing, no matter how deep it was buried. The tension in the courtroom reached a breaking point. Everyone leaned forward, holding their breath as Burke prepared to speak. His throat felt dry, and the enormity of what he was about to do hit him like a tidal wave. For years, he had been complicit, silent in exchange for power and security. Now that silence was coming to an end. Molly's eyes met his once again, grounding him. There was no turning back. "Fine," Burke began, his voice hoarse but resolute. "The first name you need to know is Thomas Randall." The name echoed through the room like a bomb going off. People gasped audibly. Randall was a well-known real estate tycoon, a public philanthropist, and a man with deep ties to city politics. For decades, he had been untouchable until now. Reporters furiously scribbled notes, capturing every word. Burke continued, his voice gaining strength. He wasn't alone. There's also Daniel Prescott, the head of the Prescott Financial Group, and Mayor Joseph Harper. They've been laundering money, bribing officials, and silencing anyone who threatened to expose them. Chaos erupted again. Voices rose in disbelief and outrage. The names Burke had just uttered represented the very pillars of the city's power structure. Cameras flashed incessantly, capturing the stunned expressions of everyone in the room. Molly stood unmoving, her presence still and watchful as if guarding the truth Burke had finally unleashed. Judge Hamilton banged his gavel, trying to restore order. His expression was one of grim determination. "Quiet. I will not allow this courtroom to descend into chaos." The noise subsided slowly. Hamilton leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Mr. Burke, you're making serious allegations. If proven true, this case could lead to criminal investigations against some of the most powerful figures in this city. Are you prepared to testify under oath regarding all of this?" Burke nodded. His hands were steady now. He had carried this burden alone for too long. Speaking the truth didn't erase what he had done, but for the first time he felt a strange sense of freedom. "Yes, Your Honor, I'll testify," Rachel Morgan whispered to her photographer, her voice barely audible over the weight of the moment. "This is the story of the decade. No, the century." Burke's lawyer sighed in defeat, shaking his head slowly. The courtroom was on the edge of a monumental shift. The walls of silence and corruption that had shielded the city's elite were beginning to crumble. Everyone present knew that Burke's testimony would ignite a firestorm that could not be contained. Molly finally moved, stepping back slightly but still watching Burke. It was as if she understood that her mission was nearly complete. But the danger wasn't over. The people Burke had exposed wouldn't go down without a fight. The storm that had been brewing for years was about to explode, and Burke stood directly in its path. The courtroom remained deathly silent, the weight of Burke's revelations hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Judge Hamilton leaned back in his chair, processing the gravity of what had just unfolded. For years, whispers of corruption had plagued the city, but no one had dared to speak openly until now. With Burke's confession and the names he had provided, the foundations of power were finally beginning to crack. Burke stood in the middle of it all, a man who had both perpetrated and exposed the corruption that had festered for so long. His lawyer quietly advised him to sit, but Burke remained standing. The fear that had gripped him for years was gone. He knew retaliation would come, but for the first time he felt unburdened. As the truth settled in the minds of everyone present, he realized something. Molly had given him the courage to face what he had feared most. The judge spoke, his voice firm and steady. "Mr. Burke, this court will take your testimony into account. However, you will still face charges for your role in these crimes. Cooperation may reduce your sentence, but justice must be served." Burke nodded solemnly. He had expected nothing less. He wasn't seeking forgiveness. He was seeking redemption in the only way he knew how, by exposing the truth. He glanced once more at Molly, who stood at the edge of the room, her eyes calm and observant. The storm that had chased him all these years seemed to dissipate as he looked at her. She was no longer just a reminder of his guilt. She was his reckoning and his chance to set things right. Rachel Morgan rose from her seat, her mind racing with the story she would write. This trial would change everything. The names Burke had exposed would send shockwaves through the city's power structure. There would be raids, investigations, resignations. But beyond the political fallout, she saw something more profound. The journey of a broken man confronting his sins, led by a dog who refused to let him forget. As the court adjourned for the day, people began to file out, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Burke remained where he was for a moment, his gaze fixed on Molly. Slowly, he approached her. She didn't flinch, watching him with the same quiet intensity. He knelt down, his voice soft and filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Molly. I was a coward, but you didn't give up. You brought me here. You made me face the truth." Molly's ears twitched, and for the first time that day, she wagged her tail ever so slightly. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. Burke stood, a faint sense of hope stirring within him. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he had taken the first step toward redemption. As the courtroom emptied, Molly walked beside him, her presence a quiet reminder of both the pain of the past and the possibility of a better future. Outside, the gray clouds began to break apart, and rays of sunlight streamed through the windows. The storm was over. A new chapter had begun.